Good morning. I would like to talk this morning about some misunderstandings about the age factor in language learning. And what I have to say here today, I'm going to try and clear up a number of misunderstandings about the age factor in second language acquisition, misunderstandings which are the result of a reliance on an outdated or unbalanced acquaintance with or interpretation of the data. Thus, for example, there is a question of whether there's a qualitative difference between children and adults in relation to language learning, and whether this difference applies in all contexts. This has all too often been answered by linguists as well as the general public with a rather cavalier disregard for the detail of the relevant facts. I'll begin with a look at the work of the two oft-cited founders of the notion that adult language acquisition is fundamentally different from and inferior to language learning in childhood, namely Penfield and Lenneberg. I shall go on to weigh recent evidence for and against the hypothesis that there is a critical period in the context of naturalistic second language acquisition. I shall then turn to the question of the effects of early instructed second language learning. Finally, I shall say something about second language learning late in life, in the third age. So, Penfield and Lenneberg. Although the pronouncements of Penfield and Lenneberg on age and language learning date back to the 1950s and 60s, both these researchers are often still invoked as figures of authority in relation to the effects of maturation on language acquisition capacity. The problem with this respectful adulation is that it often obscures the fact that both of these research giants offered opinions which recent research does not support. Penfield based his approach to this matter on his interpretation of the evidence regarding brain plasticity. He claimed that the optimal period for language acquisition ends when, at the end of childhood, the brain starts to lose its plasticity. He says, for the purposes of learning languages, the human brain becomes increasingly stiff and rigid after the age of 9. This claim was based on the reported observation that there was a greater likelihood of language functions being transferred from an injured to a healthy part of the brain in children than in adults. The notion that beyond childhood the brain becomes less adept at language learning inspired Penfield enthusiastically to promote early foreign language instruction, which we'll come back to later. Now, the current consensus among cognitive scientists is that the brain retains plasticity throughout life, and that it may be modified by experience at any age. Even more importantly, many neurobiological studies fail to relate differences in brain activation patterns to differences in target language proficiency. Thus, they do not imply anything about critical periods. As for Penfield's sermonizing about the wonderful advantages offered by early foreign language instruction, this is very much at odds with the findings of more than 40 years of subsequent investigation. Again, we'll come back to this later. Now, Lenneberg. Lenneberg's thinking was mostly concerned with first language development, but that did not prevent him touching on second language issues. He is well known for such assertions as, after puberty, the incidence of language learning blocks rapidly increases, or foreign languages have to be learned through a conscious and laboured effort, and foreign languages cannot foreign accents cannot be overcome easily. He accounted for these alleged problems in terms of a developmental process in the brain, which according to him was completed by the critical age of puberty. The process referred to was that of lateralization, the lateralization of language functions to the brain hemisphere dominant for language, which was usually the left hemisphere. Lenneberg's version of the nature and timescale of lateralization is no longer taken seriously by neuroscientists. Current research suggests a complex and multifactored relationship between lateralization and age. In any case, while Lenneberg suggests puberty as a critical age, there are many other candidates for the critical age, as well as ideas about the extent of its consequences. With regard to Lenneberg's claim about what declines at the critical age, more recent research does not necessarily take the line that, for example, a native black accent cannot be acquired beyond puberty. In any case, maturation is seen as inextricably entwined with other factors having to do with learner orientation and experience. Okay, we can agree that both Penfield and Lenneberg merit recognition as researchers who made a powerful impact relative to the idea that our language learning capacity is programmed to undergo a sudden and serious decline at a particular point at the end of childhood. In common with a large number of researchers taking this maturational line, let it be said, they disagreed as to where precisely this point is located. They differed as to what the exact critical age was. Now, while acknowledging the resonance of their theorizing, we also have to acknowledge that they both got things wrong, seriously wrong. Now, on the matter of the critical period hypothesis, the idea that biological aging puts constraints on what can be attained by language acquires beyond a certain point is labelled the maturational approach or the critical period hypothesis. This notion probably still has to be regarded as the mainstream attempt at an explanation of age-related differences in language acquisition. The critical period hypothesis, or CPH, has been applied to both first language acquisition and to the acquisition of additional languages, and has, as already indicated, been with us for more than half a century. There have, of course, always been CPH doubters. Researchers are now increasingly regarding age as a highly complex factor, a macro variable, and are calling for dimensions other than maturation as such, in its strict sense, in other words, to be taken into consideration in this context. In general, in biology, the term critical period is applied to a limited phase of the development of an organism during which a particular capacity or behavior must be acquired, if it is to be acquired at all. One example often given is the case of imprinting in ducklings, which, for a short time after hatching, become irreversibly attached to the first moving object they see, usually, but not always, the mother duck, after which they develop a fear of and aversion to strange moving objects. The period between the onset and the offset or the following behavior is called the critical period for imprinting. So if language acquisition in human beings is affected by the limits of such a critical period, like that for example, of imprinting in ducklings, the implication would seem to be that unless language acquisition begins before the period ends, it will not happen. Some of the first language findings cited in favour of a critical period refer to cases of children who, because of parental neglect, are deprived of the experience of language in childhood. Such children who are rescued in adolescence typically do not fail to develop language, but their progress seems to be of a limited or unusual kind. So it is not true that these children fail to develop language, but as I said, their language tends to be a bit unusual in some ways. Lindeberg, whose work I discussed and who is often called the father of the critical period, he was not convinced of the value of such evidence in relation to his hypothesis, seeing it as interpretable simply in terms of the general damage done to an individual by isolation and deprivation of interaction. So he didn't see this as an exclusively language-related phenomenon, and he thought that neglect or abuse would have many effects on the organism, not just in relation to the language. Other L1 evidence comes from profoundly deaf subjects deprived of sign language input in their early years, and who then acquired sign language as their first language at a later age. Such studies have not found an abrupt cut-off point to successful sign language acquisition, or that sign language completely fails to develop. It would have revealed certain deficits in the language of the later signers. Being deprived of language-mediated social intercourse during a particularly intense phase of cognitive development is certainly likely to have general psychological or cognitive effects. For example, I've said similar things regarding feral children. It may well be these general effects that are reflected in late signers' subsequent language development. As I've said, the two pieces of evidence usually cited in favour of the critical period for first language development are feral children deprived of parental care during their early years, or deprived of language input during their early years, and children who acquire sign language late in life. Okay. And I would suggest that neither of these two arguments can be regarded as totally demonstrating the critical period. Other explanations for the effects that we see in these cases are certainly there. Parental neglect, as Lindeberg said, will have a number of consequences, including language consequences, maybe, but he doesn't regard it certainly as a critical period consequence as such. The evidence quoted in favour of the critical period notion in relation to additional languages has its origin mostly in studies on immigrants' language development. From the middle of the last century, there has been a considerable amount of research showing that younger arrivals in a country where the dominant language is different from the immigrant's home language or languages are more likely than older arrivals to end up passing for native speakers of the new language in terms of all aspects of the proficiency they attain. Note that these studies show the younger development tendency to be just that, only a tendency. Not all immigrants who arrive in their new country in childhood end up with a native-like command of the language of the host country, and those who arrive later in life do not necessarily fail to attain the levels reached by younger arrivals. So it's only a tendency we're talking about. One might note in this connection, in connection with the success of some older immigrants, Kinsella and Singleton's study. This involved 20 native English speakers whose average age of significant exposure to French, that's to say arrival in France, was 28.6 years. All resided in France, and all reported at least occasionally passing for native speakers of French. These participants and a control group of native French speakers were asked to identify some regional French accents and to complete a test incorporating lexical and grammatical elements. 3 of the 20 participants involved scored within native speaker ranges on all tasks, outperforming many of the native speakers on the accent recognition task. These cases, such cases as those of Kinsella and Singleton's subjects, that is to say the most native-like subjects, don't suffice, however, to falsify the CPH for its staunchest advocates. With such research as the criterion for falsification is what they call scrutinized native likeness, with regard to all linguistic features in the later learner. So passing for a native speaker occasionally, or even most often, usually doesn't suffice from their point of view. They demand scrutinized native likeness, as they on every occasion, in every set of circumstances, passing for a native speaker. Birdsong comments that because of the mutual influence of the multilingual's knowledge of his or her languages, he says native likeness will eventually be found. So this criterion of scrutinized native likeness will never be met. Okay? His conclusion is that if across-the-board native likeness is what is required to disconform the CPH, the CPH is invulnerable to falsification. Birdsong comments that because of the mutual influence of a multilingual's knowledge of his or her languages, non-native likeness will eventually be found. His conclusion is that if across-the-board native likeness is what is required to disconform the CPH is invulnerable to falsification. Okay, so that one can't disprove the critical period hypothesis if this is what's required to disprove it. As Birdsong implies, an objection to this whole notion of native likeness being the ultimate criterion is that, as Cook has long argued, while on every side the use of additional languages is judged against the monolingual standard of the unilingual native speaker, there is in fact no intrinsic reason why the level of proficiency of a user of additional languages should ever be exactly the same as that of a monolingual native speaker. The interaction between language competencies inevitably has subtle and not so subtle effects on language performance. Birdsong argues, for example, that, quote, minor quantitative departures from monolingual values are artifacts of the nature of bilingualism, wherein each language affects the other and neither is identical to that of a monolingual. So note that he is saying that the first language of bilingual is also not the same as that of the language of a monolingual native speaker. Okay, so this is an argument which is often put in ground to multi-competence. All languages affect each other. All languages in the mind affect each other. The growing consensus is that additional language users' relationship with their languages cannot be explained simply in terms of maturation. In immigrants, proficiency attainment in the host country language can also be related, for example, to the development of linguistic or cultural identity and to socio-affective languages generally. So there are important differences in the experience of younger and older immigrants in terms of what they arrive with and in terms of various aspects of their life in the new country, which can plausibly be seen as impinging on proficiency attainment in host country language and on the role of this language among immigrants arriving at different ages. In particular, these relate to the different stages of development of linguistic and cultural identity among younger and older immigrants, which in turn influence openness to friendships among different groups. Thus, for example, Jar and Aronson found that children amongst their participants enjoyed more L2 context of use than adolescents, having a higher number of L2 speaking friends, while the adolescent shows more L1 speaking peers as their friends. Okay, this is a common feature one finds among immigrants. The young children are open to friendships with everyone, while adolescent immigrants tend to veer towards speakers of their own language community. This is found in a number of studies. Further exploring the socio-affective dimension, let us look at 3 studies which show that maturation is not necessarily determinative when it comes to learning other languages, and that a strong socio-affective factor often underlies success in this connection. In the first of these studies, Marinova's study, found that the most proficient participants in her group of 30 post-pubertal learners of English cohabited with native English speakers, attaining native levels in all domains tested, including accent in spontaneous speech. So we have a group of participants, we have a group of immigrants, post-pubertal, and the ones that do best, which are native-like in all areas, are people who are actually living with speakers, native speakers of English, in fact. In Munoz and Singleton's study, the participants were 12 female late learners of English resident in Ireland, who generally were rated as having a foreign accent, but 2 of whom scored within the native speaker range. It emerged that these 2 exceptional learners had very, very close contact with English speakers. They were connected effectively to English native speakers, One had an English-speaking husband, okay, and the other had an English-speaking boyfriend, whom she later married, okay. The other participants all operated in Spanish-speaking home contexts. So here again, the two native-like participants were closely connected affectively and romantically, one might say, to English native speakers. Finally, to return to Kinsella and Singleton's research, with regard to the three participants who across the board scored within native speaker ranges, it transpired that all three, one, conducted their social life primarily through French, two, identified themselves closely with the Francophone community, and three, had French life partners. All were married to French partners. In other words, in every one of these studies, the three studies I've cited, the personal data reveal a factorial dimension involving the quality of the emotional experience of encountering a new language. Moy has offered the view that ultimate attainment in additional languages is a function of the quantity and quality of language experience rather than simply a matter of maturation. She talks about the above discussed identity question as well as the importance of consistency of contact with the native speakers, the use of additional languages across multiple domains, motivation and positive attitude towards the language culture. She comments that the insights, quote, the insights from the empirical research highlight these relationships between age, affect, and linguistic experience, signalling a welcome shift in the critical period paradigm. So, to sum up, whereas previously the view was that just maturation, the fact of aging, the process of aging, was the most important thing to take into account in relation to later proficiency. We see now, in more recent work, that there are other dimensions: identity, affect, and experience, and these other aspects seem to be as important as age. On the basis of the foregoing, we can say that if scrutinized innate native-likeness in later L2 learners is the criterion, as Bernthog states, the CPH in the context of additional language learning cannot be disproved. Okay, so we should give up this discussion in a sense, trying to prove or disprove the critical period. It's a non-starter because of the other factors involved. The reason for the slight differences between native speakers and non-natives almost certainly has to do with the effects of multi-competence rather than age, or as well as age. And as our measuring instruments become more delicate, such differences will undoubtedly be shown consistently to mark the performance of very young as well as more L1 entrenched adolescents and L2 and adult L2 beginners. It seems more and more likely that the reason why younger L2 starters in the naturalistic environment in the long run tend to be more proficient in the L2 than older starters is attributable to a range of socio-affective factors, to how they experience the L2 rather than to physical maturation as such. Now, we turn to the question of early second language instruction at school. About 60 or 70 years ago, under the influence of enthusiastic and influential advocates of early L2 instruction in the school curriculum, such as Penfield, there began a trend to reduce the starting age of L2 learning. At first, this trend was limited in extent, sporadic and slow. In recent times, however, it spread all around the world and accelerated dramatically, especially in regard to the teaching of English. It has done so not on the basis of relevant research. On the contrary, it actually flies in the face of empirical studies, which for more than 40 years have found that in a normal school situation, pupils who are taught an L2 at primary level do not, in fact, in the long run, maintain the advantage of their early start. As long ago as the 1970s, investigations were conducted which again and again failed to verify the capacity of early instruction to deliver higher proficiency levels than later instruction. And this has been the consistent finding since. Moreover, even later beginners who benefit from less learning time generally prove in due course to be equal or superior to the early beginners across a range of measures. To illustrate the point, in a very recent study called Beyond Age Effects, Fenninger and Singleton looked at the effects of an earlier start, age 8, and a later start, age 13, to the school learning of English as a foreign language in Switzerland. The study drew on cross-sectional data on more than 200 learners and longitudinal data gathered between 2009 and 2015 from a further 200 learners. The results of this study provided no clear evidence of any special advantage to beginning the study of second language early. It was found that in the first year of secondary school, the early starters, who had 5 years more experience of school exposure to English than the later starters, demonstrated superior lexical knowledge to that of late starters. So at the beginning, they were superior to the later beginners. This discrepancy was enough to influence the degree of cross-linguistic influence present in the output of two groups. The later starters, who were less proficient in lexicosemantics in terms of their stage. However, just 6 months after the later starters had caught up with the early starters and sometimes even surpassed them in number of domains. Okay, so the early starters at the beginning of secondary school were better than the later starters in all kinds of domains. Okay? But 6 months later, this was not the case. 6 months later, the later starters had, in most respects, caught up the later starters and even surpassed them. The later starters also proceeded at a faster rate when acquiring morphosyntactic forms and structures that were selected on the basis of the class of search to cover the spectrum of difficulty for the late L2 learners, such as non-salient inflections and articles. But what is more, the earlier starters were not able to retain their learning advantages in the longer run. All age-related differences were leveled out over the second course of secondary school. So, the general picture is this. The early starters at the beginning of secondary school were superior, okay? After 6 months, the later starters had caught up, mostly, and by the end of secondary school, all differences between early starters and later starters had disappeared. And this is not a unique finding. It's the finding which recurs again and again in studies, as I said, over a very long period. What this means is that overall the later starters did better than the early starters, as they were able to acquire much more second language knowledge, as much second language knowledge as the early starters within a very considerably shorter period of time, and to progress faster than younger starters on a variety of oral and written tasks. The beyond age effect studies also revealed that the learner's language competence depends critically on the intensity and quality of the learning environment rather than quantity and length of instruction. Intensive, concentrated programs bring about more learning than programs in which the same number of instructional hours are distributed over a long period of time. What of the situation where pupils are immersed in target language? Does an early start yield advantages in this case? The short answer is no. In highly celebrated 1986 study, a comparison of early immersion and late immersion students showed the late immersion students doing on the whole better than the early immersion students. When two late immersion groups were compared, one with the other without early partial immersion experience, the group with early partial experience was found to perform better, which is hardly surprising, given the considerable extra exposure they received to the target language. But interestingly, the lead they evinced were limited and not consistent. A frequent finding is that older immersion learners are as successful as younger immersion learners, despite shorter periods of immersion. Supporters of the CPH, by and large, have accepted evidence of the failure of early L2 instruction to deliver advantages over later L2 instruction. And they interpret their own findings as consistent with it. Thus, two of the most oft-quoted CPH advocates, Johnson and Newport, take the view, quote, that the learning which occurs in the formal language classroom may be unlike the learning which occurs during naturalistic immersion, so that early instruction does not necessarily have the advantage for ultimate performance that is held by early naturalistic immersion. Another CPH champion, De Kaiser, agrees. For him, school-based L2 learning is typically explicit in nature and largely unaffected by maturational constraints. Rather than, he says, suggesting the importance of starting early, age differences indicate that the instructional approach should be different depending on age. So, now let's come to the final section of the talk. The question of foreign language learning in late adulthood, which merits attention for a number of reasons. World society is aging. It is projected that in about a decade, the number of people in the worldwide population aged 60 or over will grow by 56%, which makes older adults the fastest growing segmentation of the world's population. Young and even mature people are immigrating from their homelands for various reasons. When settled in the new country, they start families. Children are born who do not always speak the native language of their grandparents or even their parents. Grandparents may find themselves in the undesirable situation of not being able to communicate with their grandchildren. This is not a trivial concern, you know, where children end up speaking a language. I know of some cases. You know, I know a Chinese family who brought their children to Ireland, and the children actually learned English by their adolescent years, rather than they had still some Chinese, but essentially they were English speakers. And there are extreme cases where the children can't communicate to the parents in the native language of the parents. And it's even more frequently the case that children cannot communicate with their grandparents in the grandparents' native language. The increase in mobility across the world has created the desideratum for travelers and migrants to communicate comfortably in languages not well known to them, which the present-day third age generation is generally ill-equipped. The onset of retirement often constitutes the beginning of a period of personal achievement and fulfillment. And individuals may devote their retirement to traveling, taking up new hobbies and learning new skills. Adult L2 learning may be in this context a pleasurable lifestyle choice. So, older people, like myself, may choose to learn a second language. I have various second languages already, but I'm currently trying to learn Russian. Okay? So, you know, the people of my age can choose to learn a second language, or third or fourth second language, in their retirement years, okay. But the learning of the additional languages in the third age has only recently begun to be researched intensively. Finnegan and myself have recently produced a review of research in this area, which is going to appear shortly. In the popular conception, the view is that older adults suffer from cognitive deterioration. This view is borne out by some evidence of a decline in capacity with increasing age for visuospatial calculation and for general learning. There is some evidence, there seems to be some evidence for cognitive deterioration. Even though verbal and general knowledge seem to remain stable. Many researchers, however, have claimed that healthy elderly people do not uniformly exhibit general cognitive decline, and where that decline occurs, it often is a precursor of dementia. The cliche, of course, is that as we get older, our memory gets worse. In the case of people with dementia, this is of course true, and it may be that folk wisdom in this matter is influenced by such cases. Certainly older people's judgments about their own memory tends to be neither kind nor reliable, and memory failures seem to be judged more harshly in the elderly than in younger age groups. Where if an older person forgets something, that we attribute his or her forgetting that thing to age, quite simply. Where people forget things at every age. It has to be said, though, that the issue of memory, speed of processing and aging is still very much under debate. For example, it's argued by some that aging is not associated with a decline in memory capacity as such, but that the slowing down of processing has to do with various kinds of retrieval interference, perhaps relating to the amount of material the older brain has to cope with. When you're older, you have much more in your mind, in your brain, and it's quite likely that you often can have retrieval difficulties because of the amount of material in your brain, in your mind. There are some beginnings of evidence for that view. And there seems to be some evidence that older learners change the performance of many neuropsychological and psychometric tests might simply reflect experience-related performance differences, such as memory search demands, which escalate as experience grows. So the question of cognitive decline in older adulthood remains an open one. You know, dismissing older people as cognitively in decline is not justified by the current state of evidence as a general picture. A challenge faced by older language learners, of course, has to do with age-related defeatism, the sort of internalized ageism which frequently characterizes third-age learners. Older learners often seem to believe that the changes experienced by them in the course of aging will inevitably have a negative impact on their learning capacity and progress. Even before starting an activity, older learners often assume that despite their best efforts, their results will be poor, which obviously has consequences for their engagement in the activity. Adult educators have, over the years, commented on their impressions of teaching older learners and some of the difficulties older learners seem to face. Brenda, for example, talked about the problems he has observed in his older foreign language learners with auditory imitation and memorizing, as well as with responding orally. He also made mention of the fact that there are often problems of apprehension and bewilderment. He also remarked, however, that older learners appear to excel in some domains. For example, he commented favourably on their command of reading skills, their understanding of grammatical principles, and the way in which they coped with lexical learning. We can perhaps attribute these positive dimensions to older learners' experience of life and of language. Other adult educators have remarked that many older students return to the classroom with high excitement and high motivation levels. So, concluding remarks. First of all, the two great 20th century figureheads in the domain of age and language learning, Penfield and Lenneberg, had enormous influence on the way in which the age factor was for many years perceived, conceived, and discussed in second language research circles. Neither Penfield or Lenneberg was really researching the second language dimension. Neither of them was a second language acquisition researcher. Indeed, they were writing at a time when second language acquisition research, as we currently understand it, didn't really exist. And yet their names were, and to some extent still are, spoken with reverence in the second language acquisition domain. we may not have a problem with honouring them thus. But it's incumbent on us always to bear in mind that the way in which they talked about their central contentions, loss of brain plasticity on the one hand and lateralization on the other, was fundamentally incorrect. The pronouncements of Penfield and Lenneberg were of course instrumental in the widespread reduction of the age-related dimension in second language attainment to physiological maturation. The ensuing erection of the critical period hypothesis rapidly transformed itself into a proliferation of hypotheses. To quote Adam et al., quote, "The end of the critical period for language in humans has proven difficult to find, with estimates ranging from 1 year of age to adolescence. The great variety of answers to the question of when the critical period ends, as well as what its affects, places the whole notion, in my view, under a cloud. The use of scrutinized native languageness as a criterion for whether or not older second language beginners have beaten the critical period is, of course, a bizarre test, simply because of the fact that, as the multi-competence perspective makes clear, entrenched language knowledge influences all other language knowledge. In any case, language researchers of all persuasions now understand that socio-affective factors confound the maturational factor, and that to regard the macro-variable starting age as capable of isolation is an exceedingly vulnerable stance. With regard to instructional second language learning, the almost universal popular opinion that the almost universal popular opinion that beginning to learn an additional language at kindergarten or primary school confers a clear linguistic advantage over those who started learning at secondary school turns out to be contrary to the truth. This emerges from several decades of research in this area, which consistently shows that later learners, later starters, do at least as well as earlier starters with a similar length of exposure, and that on the whole, such later starters eventually start to outstrip earlier starters with several more experience of the language in question. Moreover, even in immersion education, it's been shown that earlier beginners fail to outperform later beginners. Unlike the earlier sections of this paper, this discussion goes beyond interesting theoretical issues and enters the realm of workaday socio-educational reality. It deals with promises made which have not taken on board long-standing research findings and which accordingly have not been met. Finally, with regard to second language learning in older adulthood, the platitudes that have frequently been offered about general decline in cognitive ability and motivation with advancing years seems to require re-examination. There seem to be real empirical doubts about their veracity. Thank you for your attention.